There is a joke that goes around classical literature circles. Average people, and engineers, think that the villain of Frankenstein is the creature, on account of all the murders and such. Educated people know that the real villain of Frankenstein is Victor himself. However, upon reviewing the weight of the evidence, I think there is a far more likely explanation for Victor Frankenstein's situation. Victor is the creature, and I can prove it to you, using only the text and an uncomfortable amount of mystery and true crime knowledge. So let's start by summarizing Victor's tale, in chronological order, with as little flourish and as much fact as we can manage. Alphonse Frankenstein, Victor's father, marries his former friend's daughter, Carolyn, after his friend dies. They travel extensively for a period of time, during which they have Victor. On one of these trips, they find a beautiful child named Elizabeth Lavenza, and they convince her guardians to give up custody to them. They settle down in Geneva with a summer home on the shores of Lake Como, where they proceed to have 2 additional children, Ernest and William, over the course of the next decade and a half. Victor and Elizabeth are raised together as siblings, and make friends with one of Victor's classmates, Henry Clerval. They also partially adopt and employ a local girl named Justine Moritz. As Victor is about to leave for college, Elizabeth is struck ill with scarlet fever. While taking care of Elizabeth, their mother also contracts scarlet fever and then dies. Victor proceeds to college in Ingolstadt, where he is alone for the first time in his life. He spends 3 years there in study, and during this period he supposedly constructs the creature in question out of stolen body parts. Henry Clerval arrives to begin his schooling, but finds that Victor has taken ill with a severe fever and hallucinations. Victor is set to return after his recovery, and receives letters from Elizabeth and his father. William, the youngest Frankenstein child, is found strangled to death. Victor rushes home to find that Justine Moritz, the girl that they took in, has been accused of the crime, because she had in her possession an object that William was holding at the time of his death. Victor is certain that the creature he supposedly created is the real killer of William, but he says nothing, and so Justine Moritz is tried and executed for the crime. Victor then takes a sojourn up into the Swiss Alps, and when he comes back down, he has decided he needs to take a trip to England to find some specialized knowledge. Elizabeth and Alphonse insist that Victor take Henry Clerval with him, and so they travel together to England. Around this same time, a man named Robert Walton is preparing to leave on a journey of discovery to the North Pole. Victor and Henry travel further north to Scotland, where Victor sheds his escort to live on a remote island in solitude for some months. Soon after informing Victor of his desire to return so he can move on to bigger and better things, Henry Clerval is found strangled on the beaches of Ireland. A day later, Victor Frankenstein washes up in the same area, supposedly lost in a storm. Victor spends 3 months in an Irish prison, once more struck with a fever and hallucinations, until his father comes and bails him out. They return to Geneva via Paris, where Victor marries Elizabeth per their parents' wishes. After their wedding, Victor and Elizabeth begin their journey to Elizabeth's recently restored family estate. At a pit stop in Evian, Elizabeth is strangled to death. Victor returns home, where his father dies of a combination of old age and a broken heart. Victor, believing that the creature he created perpetrated all of these crimes, pursues it towards the North Pole. At the same time, Robert Walton has also begun his journey north. While his ship is stuck in the ice temporarily, Robert Walton and his crew spot what appears to be a massive man being pulled by a dog sled. When the ice breaks up a day later, he finds Victor Frankenstein on an ice floe in a very similar sled. After being nursed back to health, Victor tells Robert his tale over the course of a week or 2, and Robert writes down as much of this tale as he can remember each night. Meanwhile, the ship has once more become stuck in ice, resulting in the death of a few crew members. Victor discovers that Robert has been writing down his tale and edits it. The crew mutinies, forcing Robert to give up on his scientific endeavors and return home to England. Victor dies, either due to complications of a fever or disappointment. Robert supposedly sees the creature that Victor created not long after this, mourning over the body of Victor. The creature then escapes out a window, never to be seen again, supposedly because it burned itself alive. Overall, a tragic and mysterious tale of horror and scientific folly. So why do I feel like Victor Frankenstein is lying? Before we go any further, we need to discuss narrators. Now, the most basic definition of a narrator is the person telling a narrative. But I intend to complicate that definition a bit. See, there's this thought that narrators fall into one of two categories, reliable and unreliable. And I think that is an illusion. There is no such thing as a fully reliable narrator, because there is no such thing as a truly omniscient and neutral author. For example, think about narrators of non-fiction. Who is the narrator of a biography? What about a news article? What about a history book? Humans respond best when we construct facts into narratives. And whenever we write something down, we leave little fingerprints all over it. Not just in what we write, but also in the way we write it. Therefore, I will be treating reliable and unreliable as two ends of a sliding scale. Now, I am not saying that we should not strive for the truth. I am merely implying that we must view all information as not strictly falling into the categories of true or false. We must consider the impression that what a narrator says and the way they say it leave upon us and the narrative. Case in point, is this man a criminal or a folk hero? Is she a saint or a madwoman? The truth can be a matter of opinion and perspective, and that is what we must keep in mind when we discuss Captain Robert Walton. The entire story of Frankenstein is recorded by and relayed to us through Robert Walton, the ship captain who finds Victor floating on that ice floe when he's on a scientific expedition to the North Pole. Yeah, that guy. This already presents an issue. Writing down the words of another person automatically puts them through a sort of filter. Additionally, Robert himself admits that he is, in many respects, dumber than a schoolboy of 15, and that he never had a care for languages. He is of English origin and education, and, to our knowledge, speaks either primarily or exclusively English. Victor, however, was raised in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, and went to school in what was then Bavaria and is now Germany. He also mentions that his mother tongue is French. Though he does speak several languages, he mentions struggling with language at various points in his journey, and at the point in time that he would have been primarily using English during his journey to England, he was accompanied by Henry Clerval, a scholar and master of many languages. So, on top of the transcription issue, there is already a potential language barrier. On top of that, it is abundantly clear that Robert Walton has what could best be described as a sort of infatuation with Mr. Frankenstein. Some of the passages that Robert writes about Victor are borderline teenage feral fangirl levels of intense.
Even now, as I commence my task, his full-toned voice swells in my ears. His lustrous eyes dwell on me with all their melancholy sweetness. I see his thin hand raised in animation, while the lineaments of his face are irradiated by the soul within.
I don't know about you, but if someone I just met was writing stuff like that about me, I would be making several assumptions and locking all of my doors at night. It is very clear that Robert is, at best, biased in Victor's favor, and at worst, what the kids call down bad for him. Additionally, this tale is being told by, and is later revised by, Victor Frankenstein himself. His biases are not just unavoidable, they are imprinted so deeply on the narrative that we have to take everything he says with a grain of salt. Even if you wish to assume his innocence, he is limited by his own perspective and goals, and benefits from the way that he tells this story. Victor explicitly states that he is telling Robert this story to protect him from falling into the scientific obsession that he himself fell into, and even tells us that he is leaving parts out for Robert's own safety. Similarly, if he has committed any crimes beyond the ones he has discussed, such as grave robbing, he has every reason not to describe those, because even if Captain Walton is sympathetic to his cause, the crew might not be. So with that in mind, let's follow in the steps of Hercule Poirot, Sherlock Holmes, and Benoit Blanc, and start sussing out some clues. We have a total of 5 deaths in Frankenstein, 2 of which are consequences of the others, so we will pull those out for now. Of our remaining victims, all 3 were killed by the same method, strangulation. Now, for those of you who don't fear your life insurance company finding out about your bedroom activities, it's important to note that strangling is a very personal and intimate affair. I will not go into excruciating detail for the faint of heart and overly horny amongst us, but I will say that it is far from instant and requires some amount of force, if not a basic knowledge of anatomy. Additionally, all 3 victims were strangled while alone and seemed to bear no defensive marks. This would imply that either their killer was so fast that they did not have time to defend themselves, or that they knew their attacker personally. Since we have already established that this is not a quick death, it seems like the latter is far more likely, although this in and of itself is not necessarily damning. It could still be almost anyone who knew William, Henry, and Elizabeth, and who had the strength to do it, which leads us into opportunity. Victor's whereabouts are shaky at best for all of these time periods. Victor says he was not in the area at the time of William's death because he was delayed by weather. However, the only witness that could confirm this is Henry Clerval, and his feedback is a little hard to gather on account of him being dead. Likewise, no one was around for the death of Clerval, and though the other inhabitants of Victor's little island confirmed that he was there at the time of Clerval's death, his time lost at sea lines up suspiciously with the timeline that it would take to kill Clerval, drop him at the island, and return. Finally, Elizabeth was struck down when she was alone in their private lodgings. Considering the amount of danger Victor says that he thought he was in, why would he leave her alone, especially if the monster has a precedent of killing his loved ones? Why would he not lock the doors, inform the staff, even tell Elizabeth? He could have lied about what was pursuing him, but he didn't mention it at all. Likewise, the only proof we actually have that Elizabeth may have seen the creature is her horrifying scream, which I imagine is a reaction she might have had if Victor had revealed a terrible secret. Speaking of sightings, Mr. Walton and his crew are the only other living beings to have supposedly seen this creature, though we do not receive the corroboration of these other men. In fact, Mr. Walton spends a not inconsiderable amount of time discrediting the intelligence of his crew members. So much so that if one of them were to raise a doubt, it would not be hard to overrule them, either through argument of authority or intellect. Further on to this, ice can create a distorting effect, similar to a desert mirage. Ice mirages are not uncommon in the far north where Robert Walton is exploring, and tend to distort the size and shape of objects. So Robert Walton and his crew may not have actually seen a massive creature, but rather a small man, distorted by nature's sublime trickery. Now, I recognize that all of this is a bit shaky and kind of a stretch, which is why we need to move on to motive, and the ways in which Victor Frankenstein's narration tells on him. At first glance, it would seem there is no reason for Victor Frankenstein to kill these people. They are, after all, his baby brother, his best friend, and his bride. But this is where he has left fingerprints on the narrative, because I think Victor Frankenstein does not see these people as people, but rather as the toy things of his burgeoning godhood. You may notice that Victor always addresses these people with how they relate to him. He always mentions how William is his baby brother, how Clerval was his best friend, and how Elizabeth, well...
And looked upon Elizabeth as mine to protect, love, and cherish. All praises bestowed on her I received as made to a possession of my own. We called each other familiarly by the name of cousin. No word, no expression could body forth the kind of relation in which she stood to me. My more than sister, since till death she was to be mine only.
We also need to acknowledge that Victor is, well, a lot of things I can't say if I don't want to violate community guidelines. So we'll settle on basically allergic to accountability. He blames a number of parties, including his father, his mother, his professors at college, the bodies he had access to, destiny, fate, the weather. But even when he is self-flagellating about the deaths that he has caused, he is always focused on how he feels, not how the victim feels. He cannot see past his own ego to the damage he has caused. This is the foundation for understanding Victor's motives. Each death holds proximity to a specific action, which is to say, a change in the victim's relationship to Victor. William did not change his relationship to Victor willingly, but rather, his relationship was changed through the unfortunate circumstance of being described more glowingly than Victor by one of Victor's other possessions.
I must say also a few words to you, my dear cousin, of little darling William. I wish you could see him. He is very tall of his age, with sweet, laughing blue eyes, dark eyelashes, and curling hair. When he smiles, 2 little dimples appear on each cheek, which are rosy with health. He has already had 1 or 2 little wives, but Louisa Byron is his favorite, a pretty little girl of 5 years of age.
That is the last letter that Elizabeth sent before William's murder. He is the only one that she lays more praise on than Victor, and I think that made him jealous. His possession valued William over himself, the owner, and that was William's sin. This is not dissimilar from the ways that abusers will weaponize loved ones, especially children, against their victims. Justine also received praise from Elizabeth, though not as much as William. And who better to frame for a murder? And who better to frame for the murder of a sweet, innocent child than an outsider they had taken graciously into their own home? No matter how much they loved her and cherished her, she was still an outsider. And that made her vulnerable to suspicion, both by the family and by their community. Now let's move on to the death of Henry Clerval. Clerval is, in my opinion, the key to whatever Frankenstein was doing. He is the one who tended to Victor during his initial illness. He is also the one who accompanied him to England, and, in my opinion, he is the one that Victor mourns most, even more than his bride, Elizabeth. If Victor was actually doing the experiments that he claims to have been doing, there is no way that Clerval couldn't have noticed this when he was tending to it. You see, body parts have this unfortunate thing where they start to really stink after a while. So either Clairville was covering up for Victor, or the experiments were never real to begin with, though we have no mention that Victor ever received a reply from the English natural philosophers that he supposedly wrote to. I doubt that Clairville could have not seen either who he was addressing those letters to, or, if they did reach out, not heard or overheard some part of their weird science. In any case, there was no amount of caretaking or covering up that Henry could have done to protect himself from his final, fatal flaw, his desire to leave for India. Though it begins as an abstract thought during their initial trip to see friends in London, Clairville's plan to travel to India was fully crystallized by the time of his murder. It's part of why he wanted Victor to come back from his island in the first place. Being abandoned by his favorite possession would have been crushing to Victor. I propose that after sending his letter, Henry came to get Victor from his island, where Victor strangled him. Either out of sentimentality or a fear that the pieces may wash up on shore, Victor opted not to throw Clairville's body into the sea, but rather took his body to a far shore where no one would recognize him, Ireland. However, after dropping the body off, a storm threw him back into the place where he had left Clairville, which led to his imprisonment in Ireland. Finally, we have the death of Elizabeth. This one is trickier than the other two. Because there is no trial or charges associated with the death of Elizabeth, we don't get any outside perspective, as filtered as that perspective would have been. What we do know is that Victor was conveniently out of the room when he heard Elizabeth's scream. When he rushed back, he found her strangled and supposedly saw the culprit through the window and shot at him, breaking the glass. But if Victor thought that his loved ones were in danger, why would he leave her alone at all? Why would he not warn her of the potential danger like he had promised? I suspect that the scream was not Elizabeth seeing the creature, but rather her reaction to Victor explaining his crimes. Rejected by his own possession, I think Victor strangled her, pretended to rush back into the room, and then shot out the window to draw attention away from himself. Alternatively, Victor could have seen their removal to Elizabeth's family estate as a sort of betrayal, causing him to attack her. However, this is the murder that Victor leaves the most details out of, which, considering how well he has described everything else, seems very suspicious. I imagine that any further detail would have been incriminating, and so he gracefully omitted some truths in his retelling to Robert Walton. So, we have opportunity and we have motive, but I can hear you thinking, that's right, I can hear your thoughts, and you did forget to turn the stove off. You might want to go take care of that. I can hear you thinking, Victor Frankenstein is the shadow of a man. He is a lily-livered, fainting violet given flesh. And you would be correct, if Victor had not left us some other clues in the narrative to his temperament. Though he is prone to illness and weakness, Victor Frankenstein frequently has mercurial rages that seem to come over him with no provocation. He is often slighted by the simplest comments, like when his father dismissed Cornelius Agrippa as useless trash. But those reactions are magnified in Victor's supposed conversations with the creature, which, I would argue, is Victor having an argument with himself, possibly as the result of a break with reality, seeing as the monster does not actually speak to him until after the first murder. In these conversations, his mood swings wildly from sympathy to blinding rage, and outside of those conversations, everyone seems to walk on eggshells around him, only waiting until the best moment to bring him information that he might find less than optimal. So, why go north? Why flee to a remote zone where he did not know what he would find? I have two theories here, which can exist in tandem. The first is that someone figured out what Victor Frankenstein had done. Maybe it was Ernest, or a nosy magistrate, or anyone, really, and so he had to skip town. That wouldn't tell us why he chose to go north specifically, but it would tell us why he chose to leave so suddenly. The second theory is that while he was in merry old England, he heard discussions of Robert Walton's noble trip to discover scientific glories in the north, and, after the death of Elizabeth, saw it as an opportunity for redemption. Either to smudge over his previous activities with a discovery so marvelous that it would blind everyone to his faults, or to reinvent himself among the crew in the far north. And though he claimed that he is telling this story to dissuade Robert Walton from his pursuits, Victor is also the person who argues with the crew, tells them to push on further, and he only dies after the realization that they are returning to England fully sinks in. Which leads us back to Walton himself, the last person to see the creature alive. Now, ignoring the logistics of fitting an 8-foot creature through a ship window, or really through any window, I think by the end of Victor's tale, Robert had somewhat caught on to what was going on. I think that when he describes the creature's mourning, it is just the final musings of Frankenstein himself. Now, this is just a fun little theory. A lit theory. No, really, nothing I have said here is directly stated in the text. It's all inferred. The point is, when someone is telling you a story, fiction or otherwise, it is important to examine their background and motivation. Take me, for example. I doubt that I would have put this theory together if I wasn't a reformed true crime fan. The whole thing smacks of Criminal Minds level horse hockey. I also don't think I would have had this theory about this book if I wasn't a weird little goth who grew up in the Western canon. As for motivations, Patreon.com/Classical Titerature is a great place to... Okay, yes, some of this is motivated by a desire to make enough money to survive under capitalism while actually doing something I love. But I also want more people to yell about literature with. I want more people to engage with literature, even if it's in a borderline conspiratorial way. If we can't stop conspiracy theories from forming, I would much rather that energy be directed into things like research theories about what is or isn't canon in a book, not, something anti-Semitic. Hell, the Pixar theory is a great example here. People have spent a lot of words and time linking together every Pixar movie into one contiguous universe, and I think that's great. I'm sure that there are other things in my background that people could point out, that there are motivations that even I can't see within myself. The point is, we leave traces of ourselves in our writings and in what we say, little ghosts of ourselves, and we need to be careful to mind our ghosts. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go seance in Mary Shelley for our weekly book club. Thanks for watching this video and indulging my weird theories about Frankenstein. If you liked it, or if you just want to flatter my ego, you can like, subscribe, comment, share. There's all sorts of buttons you could be clicking. I'm sure you can find them. I want to do more videos like this in the future for other books that I've read to you, so your feedback is actually really helpful. If you want someone to read Frankenstein to you, so you can test how accurate my theories are, you can click somewhere on screen right now to be taken to my playlist of Frankenstein videos. I actually finished it just recently, so you should be able to go through all of the videos in order, beginning to end. If you want to stay updated on what else I'm doing, you can follow me on any of the social medias on screen now. And if you want to throw money at me, which I always appreciate, you can find me over on Patreon. Links to all of these will also be in the doobly-doo. This has been Classical Titerature. Thanks for watching.